Okay, so we'll move right in, and just to warn the speakers, myself and this afternoon Liz and Bob Keane, we're going to be ruthless at keeping you on time. So just a little fair warning there, I think. So Regan Nelson has over 15 years experience working for conservation organizations, and she's currently serving as the coordinator for the Crown Conservation Initiative and a member of the Crown Adaptation Partnership. And in 2011, she was awarded the National Audubon Society's Women in Conservation Award for distinguished work in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon Gulf oil disaster. I'm sure she has stories about that. And without further ado, please welcome Regan.
I'll give you a couple of...
Okay, great. Well, good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here, especially to Diana and Bob, who invited me to speak here today. This is my first Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation meeting, and I have to say I'm just blown away by how many people are here and the caliber of the presentations that we're going to hear today. So we're in great company, and this is really exciting. So let me be the first to welcome you to the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. I'm here today to share with you some really exciting news, and it's literally news because what I'm presenting today was really in many ways decided on yesterday here in this room. So if my presentation seems a little bit thrown together, it's because it is. But the exciting news is that there's a new kid in town. As of yesterday, we now formally have a new multi-stakeholder formal working group whose mission is to protect and restore whitebark and limber pine in the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. So this development is almost a year in the making and represents the commitment, leadership, and passion of dozens of individuals. So I'm the mouthpiece for this group today, but there's many people who I'm speaking on behalf of today. So I just want to kind of familiarize myself with my audience. How many people here live and work in the Crown of the Continent ecosystem? Can you raise your hands? All right. How many people know what the Crown of the Continent ecosystem is? Kind of familiar? And how many people have never heard of the Crown of the Continent ecosystem? Okay, a couple. All right, good. Well, I'm going to provide a brief orientation to the Crown of the Continent, and then I'm going to move into describing how the Crown High Five Working Group came into being and why, and what we plan to accomplish together. Okay, so the Crown is an 18 million acre transboundary landscape. It's almost evenly split between the U.S. and Canada. Within our borders, we have 2 countries, 2 provinces, a state, and multiple tribes and First Nations. Sitting here in Whitefish, you can see we are smack dab in the middle of this landscape. But what is it that makes the Crown so distinctive and so special and worthy of its own name? Well, let's start with its name. The Crown of the Continent is so named because we are literally North America's water tower. So this is Triple Divide Peak. It's located just down the road in Glacier National Park. If you were a snowflake and you were to fall on the western side of the peak and then you melted, you would eventually flow into the Pacific Ocean by way of the Columbia River. If instead you landed on the northeastern slope, you would flow east across Canada and empty into Hudson Bay, which is part of the Arctic Ocean. And if you happened to fall instead on the southeastern slope, you would eventually drain into the Gulf of Mexico by way of the Missouri-Mississippi River ecosystem. So we are literally the Crown of the Continent, the hydrological apex of North America. So what happens here in the Crown can impact countless numbers of people living downstream. The Crown is also an international biodiversity hotspot. We are a climatic convergence zone. As a result, the biodiversity in our landscape includes prairie species as well as maritime species, as well as species typically found both in much more northern or much more southern Rocky Mountain zones. Additionally, we're in an incredibly intact landscape. So over 60% of the landscape is in public lands, and the world's first international peace park, the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, is at our core. In fact, today there's a celebratory event happening, Hands Across the Border, that celebrates the success of the Peace Park in really representing the goodwill and harmony between the 2 nations by preservation of our extraordinary landscape. So it's really something. And then lastly, but perhaps most, I had one more picture. Lastly, but perhaps most remarkably, is the fact that the crown has an incredible level of ecological integrity. To date, the crown has had no known extinctions since the time of Lewis and Clark, and we're bound to determine that whitebark and limber will not be our first. So now that you know where we are, let's put it in the context of whitebark and limber pine. You'll see that the crown falls almost at the center of the north-south distribution for whitebark. For limber, it's a little bit different. The crown is at the northern limits of the limber pine range, which means that we're really important for the species, particularly if you think about the need for vegetation to be able to shift northward under given climate change. So you'll also see that the ranges for the two species overlap and can be found, they can actually be found growing together here in some parts of the crown. It can be kind of difficult to tell the two species apart. I am not a scientist, but the best advice I heard of was from Cindy Smith, who said, if you can look at the cones, if the cone is totally eaten all the way down, that's a whitebark, and if it's intact, it's a limber. So that's what I go by. So zooming into the crown, you can see whitebark pine is fairly broadly distributed and covers about 40% of the area of the crown. Limber pine has a more limited distribution, largely found east of the Continental Divide, and in Canada is found mostly in Alberta, although BC has some suitable habitat in the northern part of the crown. So, how are populations doing in the crown? And the answer is not great. So one of the driving reasons for us to come together as a high five working group is that the crown is really the epicenter for the blister rust infections. And unfortunately, the trend lines are going in the wrong direction. So we are about 80, and even I've heard recently more like 90% infection levels for both species. Infection levels have increased over the last decade, and they're increasing faster in limber than in whitebark. So if you're interested in how I know that information, stay tuned for Brenda Shepard's presentation later today. This is pulled from her data, and she's going to present her findings of a trend analysis of blister rust infection levels across the entire Canadian Rocky Mountains. For mountain pine beetle, our major outbreaks, I'm told, occurred in the 1980s. And in the more recent event, although we did sustain mortality, it was much more limited relative to the blister rust infections that we're experiencing. So mortality for both species, because of mountain pine beetle, peaked in 2009 and has since dropped off almost completely, which is one good news. So in the crown, unfortunately, it's not just blister rust and mountain pine beetle that threaten five-needle pine. There are a number of development-related threats that can and do remove individuals and even stands. Oil and gas exploration and development, as well as coal mining, does occur in the crown, primarily north of the border. As well, road building, laying of pipes, well pads, and other infrastructure to support these activities can potentially remove five-needle pine species. Wind farms might be a growing concern. They tend to target lower elevation windy ridges, which is just the type of habitat that limber pine likes. Logging doesn't target five-needle pine in the crown, but it can result in some incidental removal, particularly in mixed species stands. Ski areas can also pose a threat if individuals are removed to create new ski runs or to maintain old ski runs. And even heli skiing has been an issue in the past. We actually had one case where a heli ski company removed high elevation whitebark pine for a landing site. So we definitely have some human-driven threats to deal with. On top of all that, there's climate change. So Bob Keane is going to give us a good overview of what we can expect climate change to do in our landscape. So I'm not going to say anything to steal his thunder, as if that's possible. But we're also contending with decades of fire suppression, which have reduced areas that are available for colonization and led to competitive exclusion of whitebark in some cases. Okay. So now I want to give you a sense of the management context within the crown. So the pink that you'll see here represents the predicted distribution of whitebark pine in the crown. And I'm going to come back to this distribution in just a minute. But what I wanted to show you with this slide is what we mean when we say that the Crown is the most ecologically intact, yet jurisdictionally fragmented landscape in North America. So this is an animation, so watch closely. And what you'll see is there's essentially a quilt of jurisdictions that will start to overlay the full whitebark pine distribution. So this gives you a flavor of how jurisdictionally complex our landscape is. We have dozens of distinct government agencies, tribes, NGOs, and place-based partnerships. What's unique about the Crown is that, largely because we're a mountain-based ecosystem, nearly all of our public lands agencies and tribal governments have either whitebark or limber pine within their jurisdiction, as do many privately held lands. And we also have lands that are managed by non-governmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy, who actually owns and manages a good chunk of land in the southern part of the Crown that has a significant amount of limber pine on it. So each of these jurisdictions, while we all share the fate of these species, are actually each also beholden to their own missions and mandates, right? So these missions and mandates really vary widely across the Crown. So for example, in Canada, whitebark pine has been listed under the Species at Risk Act, and they're in the process right now of designating critical habitat for whitebark pine. The U.S. so far has not listed whitebark pine, treating it as warranted but precluded. The province of Alberta has listed whitebark and limber as endangered under its Wildlife Act, but Montana and British Columbia do not have similar legislation, so we don't have similar listings. In Canada, we tend to be more concerned about ongoing development that can actually remove individuals. And in the U.S., we maybe worry less about development, but more about the fact that 50% of our whitebark is located in wilderness areas with a capital W, which can preclude both legal and physical access to do restoration for these species. So, the jurisdictional complexity within the Crown has the very real potential of imposing, a major obstacle for us to be able to maintain viable populations of five-needle pine in our landscape. So to overcome this obstacle, we have to collaborate, we have to coordinate. But, this is an 18 million acre landscape, international landscape. How would we even get started? So don't worry, this is not a mistake. To answer that, what I wanted to do is back up a bit and tell you the story of the extraordinary level of partnerships that exist in the Crown, which has enabled us to come together to focus on five-needle pine. So the story starts with the Crown Managers Partnership, which was founded in 2001 to explore ways that managers could address common ecological challenges in this landscape. 15 years later, the Crown Managers Partnership is a strong and thriving network of managers that define shared conservation priorities, shared objectives, and shared measures of ecological integrity. They produce seamless transboundary data sets, which, being in a room full of scientists, I know you can appreciate. And they're focused on achieving collaborative management outcomes across the entire landscape. But that's not the only partnership that's alive and well in the Crown. There's also the Crown Conservation Initiative, which is who I work for. The CCI unites our leading conservation groups, land trusts, and academic partners around a shared conservation vision for the Crown. So working together, we can shine a light on and generate significant support for important conservation efforts, whether that's securing a new park, advocating for more funding, or even establishing new conservation easements. So the organizations in orange are Canadian organizations, and in black they're the U.S. organizations. And then there's the Wilderness Society, which has helped to catalyze new programs and new place-based partnerships like the Southwestern Crown Collaborative, which is a great example of a sub-regional effort that really has accomplished significant restoration on the ground. So we already had these three major partnerships, and 2 years ago, these three major partners decided to hold a workshop focused on how we can all work together. So this workshop was driven especially by the recognition that, thank you.
Just in case.
Thank you. I was talking all day yesterday too, so my voice is a little hoarse. But at this workshop, we invited senior level managers from all the agencies as well as the tribes and NGOs. And we asked, what are the priorities in the Crown that are most urgently affected by climate change and which could most benefit from us working together collaboratively across the landscape. And we had 6 priorities that were named, and 5-needle pine was one of those. So as a result, these 3 partners decided to form the Crown Adaptation Partnership and to tackle each of these priorities in turn. So you can see that the Crown is really blessed to have a tremendous level of trust and ability to work across borders and with multiple stakeholders based on years of partnerships. And I think this lays a really tremendous groundwork for the High Five Working Group to be successful. I'm going to go with the coffee instead of the water. Okay. So in March of this year, the Crown Adaptation Partnership team partnered with the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, both of Canada and the US, to host a workshop in Fernie, British Columbia. This is the workshop that Chip alluded to. And the workshop was focused on devising ways that we could really accelerate the pace and scale of restoration of 5-needle pine in our landscape. So we had over 87 people participate, representing 43 different federal, provincial, state, municipal, tribal, and First Nation governments, as well as conservation organizations, universities, industry, and communities. The funding for this workshop came from the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative, who's really been a terrific partner to the Crown Adaptation Partnership. So with funding from the GNLCC, we were able to do some early legwork to support this Crown-wide workshop. So Shannon Blackadder, who is with the University of Calgary, led a project to collect point data from many of the major jurisdictions in the Crown and use that to build a fine-scale predictive model of whitebark pine distribution across the Crown. So this map is freely available to anybody on sciencebase.gov. We did the same thing for limber pine. So we now have, a much clearer picture of where these species are likely to occur on our landscape, and we could start from a shared point of reference. We also worked on a project to map the distribution of restoration activities that have occurred in the Crown. So again, by collecting information from each of the jurisdictions, the project allowed us to be able to report on the total number of acres that have been inventoried, planted, or restored to date across the Crown, and to have that be spatially explicit as well. So again, just a common frame of reference for all of us to start from. So I wanted to share a couple highlights from that workshop. There were some really special things that happened in Fernie. So this here is Wayne Louie. Wayne is a member of the Lower Kootenai Band of the Ktunaxa Nation, whose ancestral homelands include Fernie, which is where we were meeting. And so Wayne came and gave us a blessing to start off the workshop. So the Ktunaxa traditionally used 5-needle pine species, specifically western white pine, to build what they refer to as sturgeon nose canoes. So these canoes were the primary means of transportation for the Ktunaxa for years. And Wayne has learned the art of building sturgeon nose canoes from Ktunaxa elders, and he's now teaching young people, passing along the tradition of sturgeon nose canoes. He spoke to us really eloquently and passionately about how difficult it is nowadays to find white pine on our landscape. He travels throughout the Crown constantly and often comes up empty-handed. So he spoke on behalf of the Ktunaxa Nation about how critically important it was to their culture to maintain this 5-needle pine species on the landscape. How am I doing on time? Oh, 6 minutes. Okay. So we also heard incredible stories from other elders with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and the Blood Nation about the role of whitebark pine seeds in their diet and in their culture. So I'm just going to skip ahead. I was worried I was going to take it the whole time. So we heard from what I like to call the elders of the whitebark pine science community as well. And I mean that in a very respectful way, of course. And, we really got to work. We rolled up our sleeves and got to work. And we talked about what is it going to take for us to be able to restore these species on our landscape. And so we identified essentially 6 primary challenges that we're facing. Certainly, there's the jurisdictional complexity that we're dealing with and lack of a formal means for coordination. There's the need for increased public awareness of the severity of the problem. There just isn't a good sense right now in the Crown of just really how in trouble our five-year pine species are, and that needs to change. There's a real need, given our limited conservation dollars and the expense of restoring five-year pine species, to really prioritize where we spend our money. There's uncertainty about how climate change is going to affect restoration effectiveness in our landscape, and there's also a lack of consistent guidance, particularly in the southern part of the Crown, about appropriate restoration in wilderness or highly protected areas. And then finally, there's this continued loss of five-year pine to development that we really need to do something about. So we did more than just identify the challenges. We also created solutions for how to address these challenges. So, that was really transformational. It was really amazing at the end of the workshop to come out with a work plan that says these are the things that we have to do together if we're going to save this species on our landscape. So our priorities coming out of that workshop were to establish a Crown-wide high-five working group. It was to develop and implement a Crown-wide communication strategy to really increase public awareness and build political will to do something about the problem. We also talked about establishing a citizen science initiative to engage the public and at the same time fill in data gaps because it's a real problem in our landscape too. We talked about the need to develop and implement a Crown-wide restoration strategy, so we're sending our resources to the best places. We talked about the need to really develop best management practices for how we use and manage or fight fire in order to protect but also secure the persistence of five-year pine forests. We talked about working with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute to provide a framework for us in thinking about how and when we do restoration in wilderness areas. And then we finally decided on the need to develop a Crown-wide mitigation strategy and best management practices that help various industry sectors avoid five-year pine loss. So, yesterday, here in this room, we had our first follow-up meeting to the Fernie workshop, and we had over 50 people attend. We had almost identical representation from the same jurisdictions that we had in Fernie, which is just a real testament to the durability of what came out of the Fernie workshop and people's commitment to this process. So this is the most exciting part of the presentation. I get to report on what we accomplished yesterday. So we actually approved a charter that formally stands up a Crown-wide high-five working group. So we now have a formal group in the Crown. Yay! We were successful in nominating co-chairs as well as associate co-chairs, so one from Canada and one from the US. So we have leadership in place to carry this group forward. And we formally set up the working group under the umbrella of the Crown Managers Partnership. So we have the legitimacy and the visibility that we need to be successful. But that's not all. We had subcommittees that have formed to carry forward each of those action items that I just went over. So this is a picture of, take it just in that room over there, of the fire group. And they're like amazing. So Bob Keene plus crew has actually already drafted a best management practices guide and is in the process of peer reviewing that, and we'll have that available early next year. We also have, we got kind of cut off, but this was our group that worked on the process for developing a restoration strategy. So let me jump through. So milestones for our first year. So by March, we're going to have a peer-reviewed guide to best practices of fire use and management in five-needle pine forests. By early spring, a peer-reviewed five-needle pine mitigation strategy, including best management practices related to avoiding, minimizing, restoring, or offsetting the loss of five-needle pine. By January, a scoping document for a Crown-wide restoration strategy and a first subcommittee meeting to draft elements of the plan. In 2017, a user's needs assessment for developing a Crown-wide inventory and monitoring database. This fall, the first convening of the communication strategy subcommittee. And then 2 high-five working group conference calls, and our next in-person working group meeting in Jasper next year, alongside this meeting next year. So, as you can see, things are cooking here in the Crown, and I'm really thrilled to be able to report on this new effort. really think that it's going to go a long way towards really amplifying and accelerating the pace and scale of restoration here in the Crown. And I just wanted to ask everybody who's a part of the Crown-wide working group to just stand up so we can acknowledge your hard work and efforts over the last year. All right. Okay, hopefully I didn't go too much over.